much, Ms Begg, and I'd like to start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Paisley North and Renfrewshire for securing this debate on an issue of undoubted importance. Colombia is suffering one of the worst humanitarian and human rights crises in the world. It has the world's second largest number of internally displaced people, with about 3 to 4 million people having fled their homes in the last 2 decades. It has one of the highest murder rates in the world. And we've heard today from many honourable members who have been personally to Colombia and witnessed the suffering of the people there firsthand. The poor peasant farmers, the indigenous people, trade unionists, human rights activists, journalists, the list seems to go on and on. And I think that while killings by gangsters are obviously a great cause for concern, for me there's something particularly chilling about state-sponsored executions and the kind of repression of individuals of different political viewpoints. It's a very affront to the foundations of a free democracy. Behind the figures and statistics that we often hear in these debates, I think it's very often the individual stories of people, particularly those who members have met, that end up being the most poignant and powerful. And I certainly felt very moved hearing the Honourable Member talking about Liliana Obando, and I'll be very much looking forward to the Minister's response in that particular case. Equally, I was shocked at this practice of killing civilians and dressing them up in guerrillas' clothing to claim their bonus for having apparently killed enough guerrillas, but actually it's just the deaths of innocent people. And for this to not just be a thing that's happening occasionally, but that it's actually systematically going on, is deeply shocking indeed. In terms of these extrajudicial killings, the Colombian Commission of Jurists show that state agents are directly or indirectly responsible for 3/4 of these extrajudicial killings, political murders and forced disappearances. And the record of the Colombian government has been rather pitiful. Last year they made a show of arresting 42 current and former members of the army for such crimes, but 38 of them have been released pending trial and now the deadline for prosecution has lapsed. And so, as many members have pointed out, even when the Colombian government say the right thing, they all too often do the opposite. The UK government has changed the position on Colombia and cut off bilateral aid aimed at demining and human rights training for the army. But, in my view, bizarrely continues to give military aid for counter-narcotics programme. The Minister shakes his head. I do hope that means that is no longer happening also, because I think in the current circumstances with an army with such a poor human rights record, that giving this kind of military aid and giving a kind of legitimacy to the army is not something we should be doing. There, of course, have been many killings also, which I don't have time to go into in my remarks about, from the paramilitary forces on the right wing, and then also from the guerrilla groups, including FARC, as well, which have left many ordinary Colombians fearing for their lives. I would just like to also briefly touch on the issue of President Uribe, who seems to be following, in my view, a somewhat worrying trend in that region of trying to extend the term of office through changing the constitution. Now, obviously, this ultimately will be an issue for the Colombians themselves to decide, and it looks like there may, depending on the Constitutional Court ruling, be a referendum where the people get to have their say. But in general terms, I think this is not a good trend for democracy. In a democracy, no one person is indispensable, and the International Crisis Group last month highlighted the real dangers that there would be for the institutions in Colombia, for the dominant executive power, and undermining the democratic checks and balances if this does in fact go ahead, which obviously could have very severe consequences for the human rights situation in the country. I am going to be brief, Ms Begg, because I want to make sure the Minister has plenty of time to respond to the very many points that have been raised in the debate. But I would just like to encourage him in his remarks to touch particularly on the human rights abuses by the Colombian army and the state itself. The government has been very strong in its condemnation of the paramilitaries and guerrilla groups, and I hope that that condemnation will be equally strong of the government and state actors in the remarks today. There's also been a very interesting debate on the issue of free trade agreements, and while I think discussions and negotiations should certainly continue, there isn't a very strong case for renewing the agreement while these human rights issues remain unresolved. And I welcome hearing what the Minister has to say on that, and in full being able to set out clearly how he thinks the government can bring pressure to bear on the Colombian government to protect the human rights of everybody living in that country.